Kushinagar, India, 2,500 years ago. The Buddha lay dying between two sal trees, his body racked with dysentery. Around him, disciples wept openly. Ananda, his faithful attendant, couldn't stop shaking. "Master," Ananda sobbed, "how can we live without you?" The Buddha's eyes opened, surprisingly gentle. "Don't grieve, my friend. Haven't I taught you that all things must pass? Even this old body must return to dust." But what happened next changed everything his students thought they knew about death. Instead of simply fading away, the Buddha did something remarkable. Texts describe him entering the first meditative absorption, then the second, the third, each deeper than the last. His breathing slowed. His face became serene. The disciples watched in amazement as their teacher systematically moved through deeper states of consciousness, finally dissolving into something beyond ordinary experience. This wasn't just a great teacher dying. This was a demonstration. "All conditioned things are impermanent," came his final word. "Work out your salvation with diligence." Then, according to later Mahayana tradition, something luminous occurred. As his consciousness departed, witnesses reported a brilliant radiance, not from outside, but from within, as if awareness itself had become light. 25 centuries later, we're still trying to understand what the Buddha demonstrated that day. Because I believe he didn't just show us how to die consciously, he revealed something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. I'm Peter, and tonight we begin the most important exploration Buddha's wisdom has ever undertaken. But I need to be honest about why this matters to me personally, and why it might transform how you see life and death. A few years ago, I experienced what I can only call a death awakening. My father was dying in hospice, and I was completely unprepared. Watching someone you love slip away while you stand there helpless, it shattered something in me. That night I couldn't sleep, not just from grief, but from a terrifying realization. I had no idea what had just happened to him. Where did his consciousness go? Was he simply gone? The thought of my own inevitable death became this crushing weight I carried everywhere. So I did what any obsessive researcher does. I dove deep into every tradition's teachings on death: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. But it was Buddhist death teachings that stopped me in my tracks. Not because they offered easy comfort, Buddhism doesn't do that, but because they offered something more valuable: detailed maps based on 2,500 years of people actually studying what happens when consciousness departs the body. Tonight we begin a series of explorations into death in Buddhism. If you've been following our journey together, you know we've explored why Buddhists don't believe in God and examined the emptiness that underlies all existence. Tonight, we step into Buddhism's most profound mystery. Buddhism teaches something that turns death upside down. Death isn't termination, but transformation. And different Buddhist traditions have developed completely different navigation systems for the same mysterious journey. But here's what changed my perspective completely. Modern science is starting to validate these ancient insights in ways that even convinced this former skeptic. Ready? Together we'll open the door to Buddhism's most profound mystery. Let me start with a story that captures everything you need to know about Buddhist teachings on conscious dying. Last year, Sarah Chen was dying of pancreatic cancer at a Buddhist hospice in San Francisco. She'd been terrified of death her entire life, but in her final moment, something remarkable happened. As her breathing stopped, she smiled and whispered to her daughter, "I can feel my body dissolving. but I'm still here. It's exactly like the teachings described. Her death wasn't an ending, it was a practice. This illustrates Buddhism's most radical teaching. Death isn't an ending, but a process that can be navigated consciously if you understand what's actually happening. So what does Buddhism say really occurs when you die? 3 insights that challenge everything most people believe. First, there's no eternal soul departing your body. The Buddha taught that what we call self is actually 5 ever-changing processes: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Picture a whirlpool in a river. It has a recognizable pattern, seems like a thing, but it's actually just water moving in a particular way. When the whirlpool dissolves, what dies? Nothing substantial was ever there. Second, death is transformation, not termination. What continues is your karmic stream, the momentum of your actions, thoughts, and intentions. As we explored in our video on karma, this isn't about cosmic punishment or reward, but natural cause and effect, like a wave traveling across the ocean, carrying energy from one shore to another. The water changes, but the wave pattern continues. Third, how you experience death depends entirely on understanding these truths. As the Dhammapada teaches, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Those who recognize the impermanent nature of selfhood approach death with clarity and even curiosity. Those clinging to the illusion of a permanent self experience confusion and terror as that illusion dissolves. But here's what initially confused me most in my research. Different Buddhist traditions seem to give completely different answers about death. At first, I thought they were contradicting each other. Then I realized something profound. They're not giving different answers, they're answering different questions. The same questions every dying person asks. During my years studying Buddhist death practices, I kept encountering the same pattern. Every tradition I studied seemed to address specific fears, specific questions that arise when someone faces death. And honestly, these were exactly the questions that kept me awake at night after my father died. Let me show you what I mean by drawing from documented accounts of how accomplished Buddhist masters have approached death, demonstrating different aspects of these 4 universal questions that every dying person faces. Question 1, what will dying actually feel like? Will it hurt? In the Thai forest tradition, when masters like Ajahn Chah were dying, they would often turn their final days into teaching opportunities. As Ajahn Chah's body was failing from complications of diabetes, instead of distress, he demonstrated something remarkable. He would tell his students, "Watch carefully, see how the body returns to its elements. This old cart is falling apart, but what was driving it continues on." This is Theravāda Buddhism's answer to what dying feels like. They map it precisely. First, your body systems fail, temperature drops, physical sensations fade. Then, emotional reactivity diminishes as sensation withdraws. Recognition of familiar faces and places disappears as perception dissolves. Memories and plans lose coherence as mental formations scatter. Finally, consciousness itself transitions from its embodied state. Ajahn Chah would describe this process with characteristic directness. The body is like a cart. When it breaks down, we don't cry over the cart. We focus on what was using it. His students watched as he demonstrated exactly what thousands of Theravāda practitioners had observed before him, the peaceful dissolution of what was never permanent anyway. For these practitioners, death isn't foreign territory. They've been watching these same processes arise and pass away every day in meditation. As the Dhammapada continues, when one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Theravāda answers the fear of pain. question 2. Can I stay conscious through the process, or will I just fade into nothing? In Tibetan tradition, masters like Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche have demonstrated something extraordinary. When this revered teacher was dying in 1991, instead of losing awareness, witnesses reported he seemed to become more lucid, more present. According to his students, Khyentse Rinpoche remained in meditation posture for 3 days after clinical death was declared. His body showed no signs of decay, and the area around his heart remained warm, exactly as Tibetan texts describe during the clear light dissolution process. This is Tibetan Buddhism's answer. Yes, you can maintain full awareness through death if you understand the process. The Bardo Thödol states, "O nobly born, now the pure clear light of reality dawns before you. Recognize it as the nature of your own mind." Khyentse Rinpoche's students described his final days as a living demonstration of these teachings. Though his body was clearly failing, his awareness seemed to expand rather than contract. The Bardo Thödol instructs, "This luminosity is your true nature. Rest in this recognition." This is exactly what Tibetan practitioners call conscious dying, maintaining awareness through stages that most people experience in confusion and fear. Khyentse Rinpoche's 3-day meditation after clinical death became legendary among Tibetan Buddhists as proof that consciousness can navigate the dying process with complete lucidity. Tibetan answers the fear of unconsciousness. Question 3. But wait, if there's no permanent self, who exactly is dying? Is this all just an elaborate illusion? Zen masters have historically approached death with remarkable equanimity, sometimes even humor. The 15th century master Ikkyu, facing his final moments, composed this death poem. Having nothing, nothing can be lost. Where is there disaster? Birds sing, flowers bloom, spring comes without invitation. Even more striking was the 13th century master Dogen, who, when asked for final words, simply said, "To die is to cast off body and mind, nothing more." Then he passed away in perfect silence. This is Zen Buddhism's most radical answer. There is no death because there is no self to die. What we call dying is actually the illusion of selfhood finally dissolving to reveal what was always true. As Dogen taught in the Shobogenzo, to study the self is to forget the self. These Zen masters embodied the teaching that death is the ultimate revelation of no self. Their calm acceptance, even laughter in the face of death, wasn't denial. It was recognition. Nothing real was ending because nothing substantial had ever begun. Zen answers the fear of identity. Question 4. What if I'm not spiritually advanced enough to handle this? What if I'm too afraid, too unprepared? Pure Land Buddhism offers perhaps the most accessible approach to conscious dying. In countless documented cases throughout history, ordinary practitioners with no special training have died peacefully through simple faith and chanting. The practice is beautifully simple. Namu Amida Butsu, sincere calling upon Amitabha Buddha's name with complete trust. No elaborate spiritual accomplishments required. Just wholehearted surrender to Buddha's infinite compassion. Pure Land's founder Shinran taught something radical. Even if I should fall into hell, I will not abandon the Nembutsu. This isn't just faith. It's recognition that Buddha's compassion extends even to those who feel completely unworthy. In Japanese Pure Land temples, you'll find countless records of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, even those who lived difficult lives, who died with serene expressions while chanting Amitabha's name. Their faces radiated peace because they had surrendered completely to something greater than their own spiritual accomplishments. Pure Land answers the fear of unworthiness. These documented examples from Buddhist history demonstrate that all four approaches aren't contradictory. They're complementary answers to the different fears and questions every conscious being faces when approaching death. Now, when I first learned about these different approaches, I'll admit I was skeptical. How could ancient meditation teachers possibly know what actually happens during death? They didn't have EEGs or brain scanners. They couldn't measure consciousness scientifically. That's when I discovered something that shook my scientific worldview. Here's where my Buddhist death studies took an unexpected turn that, honestly, challenged my materialist assumptions. I was ready to treat these teachings as beautiful metaphors, inspiring philosophy, comforting mythology. Then I encountered the research. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, spent decades studying patients who'd been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, but returned with detailed memories of the experience. What surprised me, van Lommel said, was how consistently these accounts matched descriptions in ancient Buddhist texts. Patients described leaving their bodies, moving through tunnels of light, encountering spiritual beings. The progression was almost identical to what Tibetan Buddhism calls the Bardo journey. Dr. Eben Alexander, a Harvard neurosurgeon, discovered this personally when bacterial meningitis left him in a coma for 7 days with zero neocortex function, the brain region supposedly responsible for consciousness. Yet he returned with vivid memories of journeying through remarkable realms, guided by loving presences. The experience was entirely consistent with what contemplatives have described for centuries, Alexander said. It suggests consciousness may be fundamental to reality, not just produced by the brain. Now, not all scientists agree with these interpretations. Many argue that near-death experiences can be explained by brain chemistry during cardiac arrest, residual neural activity, oxygen deprivation, or neurotransmitter release. The debate continues in academic circles, and we should acknowledge these alternative explanations. But what really convinced me was talking to hospice workers who observe death daily. Dr. Christopher Kerr has documented thousands of cases where dying patients report coherent visions of deceased loved ones, spiritual realms, and guided journeys that bring profound peace. Buddhist patients consistently demonstrate the most conscious deaths. Hospice nurse Sarah Martinez told me, they navigate the process like they have detailed roadmaps. They describe stages, sensations, and experiences that match their teachings exactly. The convergence was undeniable. Modern neuroscience was documenting phenomena that ancient Buddhist practitioners had mapped through pure contemplative investigation. But that's when I realized I was missing the most important question. So what? What does this actually mean for how I live, how I approach my own inevitable death? That's when everything clicked into place, and in a way that changed my life completely. Six months into my death studies, I was meditating one evening, still carrying that weight of death anxiety from my father's passing. I'd learned all these Buddhist theories, but I was still fundamentally terrified. Then something shifted. I was reflecting on what these masters demonstrated about the clear light of death, consciousness recognizing its own essential nature. Suddenly, a question arose that changed everything. What if this clear light isn't something that appears only at death? I sat there in meditation, and for the first time, I really noticed the awareness that was observing my thoughts. Not the thoughts themselves, but the space in which they were appearing. This luminous, knowing presence that seemed completely untouched by whatever was arising in it. And it hit me. This was it. This was what all the death teachings were pointing toward. The awareness that could observe thoughts arising and passing was the same awareness that could observe the body arising and passing. The consciousness that remained constant through all the changes of life was the same consciousness that would navigate death. I wasn't learning about some distant future experience. I was discovering what was already here, already indestructible, already free from the whole drama of birth and death. Here's something practical you can try right now. When you notice a thought arise and dissolve in meditation, you are rehearsing death itself. Every exhale can be a micro-death. This is practice here and now. If you haven't started meditating yet, check out our guide on how to meditate like a pro. It's the perfect foundation for understanding what we're exploring tonight. Every time I meditated and thoughts quieted down, I was practicing death recognition. Every moment I observed emotions arise and pass away without identification. I was rehearsing the ultimate letting go. Every instant I recognized awareness itself rather than its contents. I was preparing for the recognition that transcends death entirely. This is why studying death transforms how you live, not because it prepares you for some future event, but because it reveals the indestructible nature of consciousness operating right now. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but something fundamental shifted. Death stopped being this terrifying unknown and became curious. Like, what will it be like when all this mental activity finally quiets down completely? What will pure awareness recognize about itself when there's nothing left to distract it? Whether through Theravāda observation of impermanence, Zen recognition of no self, Pure Land surrender to grace, or Tibetan navigation of consciousness states, all Buddhist death practices point toward the same discovery. The awareness that can consciously navigate death can consciously navigate any experience. Understanding death doesn't just prepare you for dying. It awakens you to the miracle of being conscious in the first place. But thinking back to my father's death, I realized I'd found something he would have wanted me to know, that the love connecting us was part of this same indestructible awareness. Death couldn't touch what was most essential about our relationship. We've explored Buddhism's understanding of the moment of death itself, those 4 questions every dying person faces, and how different traditions provide navigation tools for conscious departure. But we've only examined the beginning of the journey. What happens after consciousness separates from the body? This is where Buddhist teaching becomes truly mind-bending. According to Tibetan tradition, after the clear light moment, consciousness enters what may be the strangest journey any being can experience, the Bardo of Dharmata, where thoughts manifest instantly as reality, where karmic visions arise with overwhelming intensity, where rebirth conditions take shape according to patterns accumulated across lifetimes. We touched on this in our exploration of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but next week we'll go much deeper into this mysterious journey. This intermediate state may last up to 49 days, but here's the revelation that will guide our next episode. What if the after-death journey isn't something that begins when the heart stops, but the very fabric of consciousness you're living in right now? Think about it. In dreams, your thoughts become the reality you experience. In strong emotions, your inner state creates the world you perceive. In meditation, mental projections arise and dissolve like living beings. What if consciousness recognizing its own creative power without the filter of physical embodiment is exactly what's happening in every moment of awareness? Next week, we'll explore how thoughts become reality in intermediate states, why some beings find immediate rebirth while others wander the full journey, and the possibility that you're already navigating Bardo states without recognizing them. If tonight's exploration expanded your understanding, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share this with anyone curious about consciousness and death. Tell us in the comments which of the 4 questions resonates most with your own thoughts about death. How has learning about conscious dying changed your perspective on mortality? Remember, consciousness is stranger than death and perhaps stranger than life itself. The exploration we're beginning together isn't just about understanding death. It's about awakening to the nature of awareness itself. Until next time, stay curious, stay wise. The mystery deepens next week, and what we'll discover about consciousness might reveal that death is not the end of the story, but the beginning of understanding what we really are.